Imagine being 8 years old. Soldiers burst into your home at dawn. They drag you away from your crying mother. You're told you're going to school. But this isn't any school. This is a place where your name will be erased, your hair will be cut, your clothes will be burned. And if you speak your own language, you'll be beaten. Between 1880 and 1930, over 50,000 Native American children went through this system. The government called it education. The schools called it civilization. But the children who survived, they called it something else. They called it cultural genocide. Captain Richard Henry Pratt founded the first off-reservation boarding school in 1879. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania would become the model for dozens of schools across America. Pratt had a philosophy. He stated it plainly in 1892. Kill the Indian in him and save the man. Not educate the Indian. Not help the Indian. Kill the Indian. This wasn't just one man's idea. This was federal policy. The Bureau of Indian Affairs believed that Native American culture was inferior, that their languages were primitive, that their traditions were savage. So they created a system to erase an entire civilization, not through war, not through violence on the battlefield, but through children, through schools, through education. By 1900, there were 20,000 Native children in boarding schools. By 1925, that number exceeded 60,000. Over 400 schools operated across 37 states. And in 1891, Congress passed a law that made attendance mandatory. Native parents had to send their children to these schools. If they refused, their food rations would be cut off. Their children would be taken by force. Think about that. Parents were given a choice. Surrender your children to cultural erasure or watch them starve. This wasn't education. This was extortion. Let me tell you what happened when a child arrived at Carlisle, or any of the other schools. The process was always the same, always systematic, always brutal. First, they cut the hair. For many Native cultures, long hair wasn't just style. It was spiritual. It was identity. It was connection to ancestors. Cutting it was mourning. It was shame. Then, they burned the clothes, the moccasins, the blankets. Everything the child brought from home was destroyed, sometimes in front of the child, sometimes in front of all the new students. Next came the uniform, military-style jackets for boys, stiff dresses for girls, European clothes that didn't fit right. That felt wrong. That marked them as different from who they were. Then they changed the name. John, Mary, William, Sarah. Simple English names, easy to pronounce, easy to remember. The child's real name, the name their mother gave them, erased. One survivor, Luther Standing Bear, later wrote, "I was stripped of my clothes, my hair was cut, and I was given a new name. I was no longer Luther Standing Bear. I was just another Indian student." Imagine being 8 years old. Everything that made you who you are, gone. In one day, 1 hour. You don't recognize yourself in the mirror anymore. Who are you now? But the worst part, the absolute worst part, was the language ban. Children were forbidden from speaking their native languages, not just in class, anywhere, anytime. If you spoke Lakota, you were beaten. If you whispered Navajo, you were punished. If you cried for your mother in your own language, you were locked in the basement. The schools had a system. They called it the silent system. Children who spoke their language had to wear a special badge, a mark of shame. They couldn't take it off until they caught someone else speaking their language. So children became spies. They reported each other. Brothers reported sisters. Friends reported friends. All to avoid the punishment. All to survive. The punishments were cruel. Beatings with belts, locked in dark rooms for days, forced to stand for hours. No food, no water, no human contact. One survivor recalled, "We learned to communicate with our eyes, with hand signals under the table. We would mouth words to each other when the teachers weren't looking." Children developed secret languages, codes, signs, anything to keep their real language alive, anything to remember who they were. But many children, they started to forget. After months, after years, they'd try to remember a word from their childhood, a song their mother sang, a story their grandfather told, and it was gone, erased, not by accident, not by time, but by design, by policy, by a system that measured its success by how completely it could destroy a culture. Think about what that means. These children weren't just being taught English. They were being taught to hate themselves, to hate their families, to hate everything they came from. The academic curriculum was minimal. 4 hours a day, reading, writing, arithmetic. That's it. No history, no science, no critical thinking. The other 4 hours? Manual labor. Boys learned farming, carpentry, blacksmithing. Girls learned cooking, cleaning, sewing, laundry. The schools weren't educating children. They were creating a servant class, a labor force, people who could work with their hands but not with their minds. One superintendent wrote in 1895, "We don't want these children to become lawyers or doctors. We want them to be good farmers, good servants. That's all they're capable of." That's what they believed. That's what they taught. That's what they built an entire system around. And religion? Christianity was mandatory. Children were forced to attend church, to pray to a God they didn't know, to follow rituals that meant nothing to them. Their own spiritual practices? Forbidden, punishable, erased. The sweat lodge, the sun dance, the vision quest, all banned, all destroyed. One elder later said, "They took our children and taught them to pray to a stranger's God." While our own ceremonies died with the elders who had no one to teach. Here's what they don't tell you in the history books. Many children never made it home. They died in those schools. From disease, from malnutrition, from abuse. Tuberculosis swept through the dormitories. Children slept 30 to a room. No ventilation, no heat, no proper medical care. When a child died, the schools often didn't tell the family, or they waited months, or they sent a letter saying, "Your child passed away peacefully," when the truth was far worse. Some children ran away. They tried to escape, to walk home. Hundreds of miles through unfamiliar territory. Many froze to death. Many starved. Many were caught and beaten. The schools kept cemeteries, rows of small graves, children who never saw home again, children whose names were changed even in death. How many died? We don't know. The records are incomplete. Some were never documented. Some were deliberately destroyed. But estimates suggest thousands, maybe tens of thousands. But some children survived. They made it home. And when they returned, they were strangers. They couldn't speak to their parents. They couldn't understand their culture. One survivor described it. "I came home after 3 years. My mother hugged me. I couldn't hug her back. I had forgotten how. I had forgotten everything." These children were caught between two worlds. Too white for the reservation. Too Indian for white society. They belonged nowhere. Many turned to alcohol, to depression, to suicide. They carried trauma that never healed, that they could never explain. And when they had children of their own, they couldn't teach them their language because they had forgotten it. They couldn't pass on their culture because it had been beaten out of them. So the damage didn't stop with one generation. It continued. It spread. It destroyed families for decades, for centuries. The last federal boarding school closed in the 1970s. But the damage was done. Over 50,000 children went through this system, over 400 schools, over 50 years. Today, many Native American languages are endangered. Some have fewer than 100 speakers left, all elderly. When they die, the language dies with them. Why? Because of these schools. Because children were beaten for speaking them. Because parents couldn't teach them. Because an entire generation forgot. The trauma didn't end. It passed down. Through generations. Through families. Through communities. Psychologists call it intergenerational trauma. Native communities today struggle with higher rates of suicide, of addiction, of poverty, of violence, and historians trace it back to these schools, to this system, to this policy. In 2021, the U.S. Department of the Interior finally launched an investigation. They're documenting the abuse, the deaths, the cover-ups, but it took 140 years. And for most survivors, it's too late. So let me ask you this. What do you call a system that takes children from their families? That forbids them from speaking their language? That beats them for practicing their culture? That changes their names? That destroys their identity? That measures success by how completely it erases a civilization? The government called it education, the schools called it civilization, but the survivors, they have a different name for it. They call it cultural genocide. And it happened here, in America, for over 50 years, to over 50,000 children. And most people have never heard of it. If this story shocked you, share it. Tell others. These children's stories deserve to be remembered. Their trauma deserves to be acknowledged. Subscribe for more forgotten history, more dark truths, more stories they tried to erase. Because if we don't remember, if we don't tell these stories, then the genocide continues.